Let's do YouTube. Ron Paul, big leader with over 30 million views, then Gingrich, Kaine, and Perry. Big numbers, Chris, and if pundits are right here, ones that aren't just chatter, they'll affect who voters pick for president come November.
Your view of Ron Paul?
Well, I think he's the only guy that's saying, listen, we need a radical restructuring of our government. And he's absolutely correct. And he is what a real conservative is supposed to be. I mean, by all stretches of the imagination, I mean, that guy's a real... I mean, there's no way you can say by any stretch of the imagination that he's not a conservative. I mean, he's a real conservative, a fiscal conservative, a social conservative, but he wants people to be able to do whatever they want. He believes in states' rights. He believes that the federal government is completely out of control, that it's too big. He believes that, you know, we have to get rid of the IRS. It's a flawed institution. He believes we have to get rid of the Federal Reserve. He believes all these things that totally make sense. And when he says these things on TV, they laugh and they make it like it's a joke. Like, even though we know that the system is completely, it's just completely unfixable. I mean, if you look at the way it is now, just it's a honeycomb of corruption and just bureaucratic BS and red tape, and it's just, God, it's
that's
so
what I was
gigantic.
That's my next question. Let's continue along Ron Paul.
It's a business. The government is a business, and we need, and at this, the way this world is structured, it's almost like we need that business to keep running in this ridiculous manner
and it's
in order
predatory.
to keep people working.
Like a drug war. It's predatory.
It is predatory. It feeds on other people. I mean, look, the whole idea behind private prisons, I mean, that's completely insane. That people can profit off of other people being in jail. Well, if that's the case, then they're going to support things that make more people
and
go
they
to
do.
jail.
They lobby to keep somebody caught with a marijuana cigarette in prison making widgets for them.
You're right, they do, and it's sickening. It's like cannibalism. I mean, it's really like a social form of cannibalism. It's unbelievable that it's legal, and that's all stuff that Ron Paul, you know, what he stands against. And any rational, reasonable person who would listen to Ron Paul talk goes, well, here's a guy who obviously understands the system, was calling the economic collapse way in advance.
30 years ago.
So obviously, Ron Paul fan. Yeah.
Huge Ron Paul fan. Honored.
And what do you like?
Honored to be on the show.
What part of his platform do you like?
Every single thing that comes out of his mouth, I go, yeah, finally. When he talks about the gold standard, when he talks about civil liberties, when he talks about everything he says, you know.
Let me tell you, have you ever seen Fear Factor?
Yeah, I'm the problem. See, you're the solution. I'm a part of the problem with this country.
No, I haven't seen it, but I'll be watching it from now on.
Right, there you go. There you go.
Ron Paul, ladies and gentlemen, come on.
All right, I posited Congressman Paul, obviously, because of the Des Moines Register poll, which has Gingrich 25, Paul 18, Romney 16. Is it in fact Paul now in the always filled GOP on deck circle?
Well, as Paul would say, it's not just his moment, it's been his decade. That's sort of the self-braggadocious thing that he said on Sunday when asked about his surge in the polls in Iowa. And while I don't think I would go quite that far, you could definitely make the case that Ron Paul, perhaps more than any of the other candidates in this race, has influenced this race and the positions taken in this race and the focus of this race through his just unswerving focus on fiscal issues and his hardcore libertarianism over the course of his career in Congress. In many ways, you could argue that he not only fathered the Tea Party, but he has at least influenced the initial stages of this race to the point where you have other candidates talking about abolishing departments of the agencies, cabinet-level agencies of the United States government, even if they can't remember quite as many as Ron Paul can remember. And there's definitely the possibility that he could finish in the top 3 in Iowa, and that would really shake up the race.
The other thing, Christiane, I think to watch is Ron Paul.
Well, I was just going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Ron Paul is right now, he's second in Iowa, he's second in New Hampshire, and of all the people that are in the top tier, he has the most passion behind his candidacies. I would not be surprised at all, 7 weeks from now, that Ron Paul wins the Iowa caucuses and goes into New Hampshire and disrupts this field even more.
But really disrupt, or would it just be sort of a one-off for Ron Paul if he wins Iowa?
Oh, it would be disruptive. When you win Iowa, you go into New Hampshire with a certain amount of momentum. We all know this, and no one has ever taken Ron Paul seriously. Therefore, when Iowa does, everybody will stop and say, what the heck?
On the Ron Paul side, he's known to have the strongest statewide organization in terms of supporters lined up committed to him to come out to caucus for him. And you just can't underestimate the groundwork of an organization of being able to turn out a high percentage of their supporters.
Ron Paul did okay in the registered poll, but he really excelled in a straw poll of likely Iowa voters. This was yesterday in Iowa. He got 82% in the National Federation of Republican Assemblies presidential straw poll.
Talking about Ron Paul. He won a GOP straw poll Saturday in Iowa with a whopping 82% of the vote. I recently interviewed him. He is a tell-it-like-it-is guy. You can't help, but he's a nice guy. You can't help but like him.
I was sitting around with some friends. We were all on Twitter talking about the last debate, and a lot of us said, oh my gosh, Ron Paul is making sense to us. And so it was a surprising thing. I was on a plane today coming back in from Florida, and the fellow next to me and I just started a conversation, and we landed on Ron Paul and this straw poll. The fact is, he has the organization, he has the volunteers. Okay. He's going to be successful in changing the conversation. And I got to tell you, I don't count him out of winning Iowa.
Really?
Not at all. Mitt Romney can't take Iowa. Ron Paul can turn him up and turn him out.
Yeah, this is going to be such an interesting election. I mean, to be able to cover it is a privilege, because it's going to be just craziness, madness, mayhem.
It's going to be madness. Yeah. Well, the GOP is so incredibly fractured, and that's what's giving Ron Paul the real opportunity.
Okay, let's State of the Union with Candy Crowley. Federal student loan programs should be abolished. Let's listen to Ron Paul.
Anybody who's ambitious enough will get to go to college. The problem is college costs too much. And with the good intentions of giving people houses at discount, it ends up with a housing bubble, and the people who are supposed to be helped, they lose their house. Same way with education. The attempt to help people in education, all you do is you don't get better education. You end up actually pushing the price of education up. So we've delivered now hundreds of thousands of students graduating with $1 trillion worth of debt and no jobs. So it's a totally failed policy.
That kind of talk doesn't turn off voters, does it?
That kind of talk turns voters on because nobody else is speaking that truth. There are colleges and universities out there, you see them on television every day, that literally cater their tuition costs around how much federal aid they predict their students can get. The more student aid they think students can get, the higher they set the tuition costs. And so he's right. It is driving some of the escalation in cost of education. I've got 3 kids in college. I know what this game is like. The debt load they're going to have when they're out of college and not having a job and maybe paying up to half of their disposable income and paying back student loans. I mean, God help them if they can realize this American dream and not be saddled with all the debt. And so Ron Paul is making sense.
To 3 in college?
3.
Gosh. These young people who are bearing the burden, inheriting the debt, and have to fight these wars, and the military, guess what? I get more money from active military duty, twice as much as all the other candidates. They're sick and tired of it. So
Did you know that, Bob? In the 08 campaign,
and this
while you have neocons trashing Ron Paul because he's saying bring the troops home, at the last campaign and in this campaign, military members and their families gave easily more to Ron than anybody else because they understand the strain better than some politician or somebody in a think tank in Washington, D.C. that this is putting. It is a readiness issue. We're stretching. And it's expanding, ever expanding. But you're spending
none of it is that easy
$2 billion a week in Afghanistan.
Where's the money coming from?
And you talk about college campuses. I have yet to find people outside of Washington, D.C., Ron, that thinks it makes sense for us to spend $2 billion a week in Afghanistan a decade later.
No, it absolutely makes no sense. And there's no money. I mean, we're in this huge deficit. And if we can't cut the occupation of these countries, there's no hope for us. Let me tell you, there's just no hope for us. We better be willing to do it. We have to change the policy. If the design is to police the world and nation build and satisfy everybody's borderlines, believe me, we're doomed because we're doing exactly what the Soviets did. We need to change our attitude, take care of our people at home. How do you get medical care at home if you're spending all this money bombing people and then rebuilding their countries? It's insane.
Well, and the rationale for staying in Afghanistan is
to keep al-Qaeda from coming back into Afghanistan. And as we know, al-Qaeda has had a bad couple of years, and they are going back into Afghanistan.
But they're in Iraq now. They weren't there when we went to war, so we're only giving the incentive for the al-Qaeda.
Ron Paul, a straw poll favorite with arguably the most passionate base and the money to go some distance.
Ron Paul supporters are not just devoted, they are growing. His message has largely been vindicated in the last 4 years since he first ran, and his support isn't going anywhere, so no one should count Ron Paul out of this. Could end up being a big surprise with huge implications across the race.
Newt Gingrich has surged to the top of the polls, but now it appears he might have some unexpected competition in Iowa. A public policy poll shows Gingrich holds a slim 22 to 21% lead in the Hawkeye state over Ron Paul. That's right, Ron Paul.
Issue 1, the Big Mo.
There's so much frustration and people are hopping around. They're looking for somebody, and I think, quite frankly, that might be the reason we're going up in the polls.
Momentum. Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul has it. The Big Mo. The Libertarian candidate who is running on the Republican label. Dr. Paul is now positioned to win the Iowa caucuses because Iowa Republicans remain dissatisfied, many believe, with Republican contenders, notably Romney and Gingrich. Republican voters see Gingrich as zany and Romney as inconsistent. The Iowa caucuses, less than 3 weeks away, January 3, are closed caucuses, limited only to registered Republicans, i.e. GOP's true believers. That gives Dr. Paul the inside track. Also this, 1, ground support. Politicians in the state say that Paul has the best ground campaign. That means he will turn out his vote. Reminder phone calls, car pickups and returns, helping registration, etc.
A lot of eyes are on Ron Paul. He is making a big push to win over caucus goers here in Iowa. His campaign events here are packing in some of the biggest crowds. Polls show he is in the running right now to take the top spot on January 3rd. And Congressman Ron Paul joins me live right here. Congressman, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing it? Because these folks showing up at your rallies, it's not just, you know, older folks, younger folks. It's a mix. You seem to have energized folks across the continuum.
I don't know exactly what has happened because I've been saying the same thing for 30 years, but all of a sudden, you know, there's a lot of excitement. I think it's the conditions of the country and the conditions of the world because my policies have all been the same. I've been saying the same thing, but there's a lot more enthusiasm. But I think, sadly, it might represent how bad off we are in this country. The economy is in shambles, and I had talked about that and warned about it. And foreign policy, I've wanted a different foreign policy because I was always afraid we'd get bogged down, and I thought we went to war too carelessly. And the American people now, statistically, are with me on these things. They want the Federal Reserve audited. They want our troops to come home, and they don't like going into wars carelessly. So I think the issues have come around, but also the enthusiasm is building. The money's coming in easier. We have more volunteers, and we have a better staff now than we did before. So it's all coming together, and we feel pretty good about it.
It's very hard for someone to watch that debate who is not in that bubble, and I am not in the bubble.
If you had to vote for one of them, is there one you would vote for? Who would you vote for? I mean, if you had to pick.
I'd vote for Ron Paul if I had to pick. I mean, Ron Paul is at least not a panderer. He's sincere. He's got the right ideas about getting our troops home, and you know, I like Ron Paul. I think he's a cut from a different cloth than the rest of those people who are, of course, selling their souls to the corporate interests who back them, and who have just horrible society-killing ideas about America and either don't know what's real or don't care.
There's this Ron Paul experience that I think liberals have. Right? It's a very confounding experience. And I think you know what I mean. You're nodding your heads. Because you watched Ron Paul during a Republican debate, and he wildly oscillates between things that just seem contemptible and odious or bizarre, and things that seem eminently sensible, even courageous. I mean, I am always struck by how it genuinely seems courageous to me. I mean, this is not, there's levels of bravery, but he stands up there on Fox News in front of this crowd of people, in front of Republican viewers, and he says things that are so against the worldview of everyone else on stage. That's right. Everyone sitting in the moderator's chair, everyone most of the people in the crowd, except for the Ron Paul supporters who are always there cheering boisterously. And I think that it's a fascinating thing to watch. And I also think he's a fascinating figure because right now he is scaring the Republican establishment in a very profound way. And do you find yourself at all seduced by the Ron Paul experience?
Absolutely. I sit there and I root for him. He's at that age that I don't give a crap age where you can basically say what you want to say and get away with it. And like, what? I'm 75. I'm going to say this. I believe it. And there is some of that, you know, when he got into it in the last debate about this whole war thing, it was refreshing, actually. You, as an American citizen, and I try to leave the partisan politics out of it because I think that we need to pick a leader for all of us. It's refreshing to have someone be honest about that. Now, yes, he does have other problems, but I'm like, yeah.
Part of the honesty is that he is genuinely intelligent and he's not a joiner. He looks at the facts and he goes where they take him according to a certain paradigm, which any intelligent person has to have. And it's hard not to be swayed by it, especially given what a lot of the Republican candidates are like. There is a charisma. That's what he has. And where he takes it can be rather peculiar. And I think he was doing it before he was old.
But his charisma comes exactly from what Chris said, the courage. I mean, just waiting for him to say something that he believes that is smack in the face of everything else. The other thing I will say about him, it's on foreign policy, but it's also on torture, right? He's one of the first people, he will stand up there and say, this completely contravenes everything we stand for, and it is not worth
I agree with that, but I think there's also something I regret a little, because I mean, that clip you just played, that's actually a very simplistic explanation of why the 9/11 attacks happened. I don't completely agree with it. I think there's an element of truth to it. Sure. But I actually wish that he were articulating some of these arguments a bit better to force the actually address them.
This is what's interesting, and Emery, I wanted to come to you on this, because what he said there, right there, that isn't being said. No one says that on the Democratic establishment. Right. I mean, you would not see it. I mean, maybe with the exception perhaps of Dennis Kucinich when he was in the field, that is not talking about the bill of grievances that Osama bin Laden has against the U.S. as concrete things, and talking about his justification, whether you agree with it or not, and obviously Ron Paul doesn't, right? Talking about it, just talking about it in those terms, that is toxic, even on the Democratic side, right?
No Democrat would dare to say that.
Right, and that's is it because it's not true? Is it because it's just too politically explosive?
Well, for Democrats who are immediately worried about being soft on security, the idea that you would say anything that would reflect empathy or understanding
like, look at the attacks
of those
on Obama
against us,
in the most
chance.
gentle terms, saying, you know, we understand that you might have some complaints about our policies in the past. He's apologizing, he's bowing before the world.
So how do they reconcile with a Ron Paul, who is clearly a Republican, clearly a constitutional Republican? I mean, he's really entrenched. So it's sort of like what do they do with him?
Right. Well, what they do is what they do with him is as soon as he is sort of ascended to this level in the field, is that you've seen the Republican establishment go after him in a big way.
With a little more than a week until Iowans decide their choice for the 2012 Republican nominee, Ron Paul continues to enjoy strong support there, and other GOP contenders are taking aim. Looking to derail Texas Congressman Ron Paul in the First in the Nation caucus, state rival campaigns plan to air fresh TV ads and hit the phones to persuade undecided caucus goers.
All of the talk about the Ron Paul surge and the support that he has out there, the momentum that he has potentially going into these January 3rd caucuses is real.
Ron Paul wins the Iowa caucuses. Well, heaven forbid. Iowa's governor going so far as to say that if the Texas congressman wins, ignore it and look at who finishes second. My own colleague, Chris Wallace, says if Ron Paul takes Iowa, it discredits the state's caucuses. Bill O'Reilly says Paul can't win the nomination, even if he does win the Iowa caucuses. Juan Williams says, well, he's unelectable. Bill Kristol says he's unelectable. And scores of Republican State Party chairmen across the country say Ron Paul is unelectable. They fear the better Paul does, the worse the party's chances next fall look. Well, then get ready, guys, because I could be wrong, but I think Ron Paul does win the Iowa caucuses and does unleash all this ridiculous paranoia all over again. And for what? On the notion that as the Texan gathers heat, he sends his party down in flames? Didn't they say the same about another Iowa sensation named Jimmy Carter in 1976, arguing he would send his party down to defeat against an otherwise very defeatable Jerry Ford? He didn't. Or Ronald Reagan against a supposedly vastly more electable George Bush Sr. Had no way in heck he could beat Jimmy Carter in 1980. He did. History is full of candidates who couldn't make it but did, and sure shots for whom the White House was theirs, but in the end, apparently was not. Now, I'm not here as a supporter of Ron Paul, but as an opponent of anyone dismissing Ron Paul.
Establishment Republicans, well, they're not real happy with this one. A new poll shows Ron Paul on top with 23%. Mitt Romney is 3 points behind him at 20%. Newt Gingrich has dropped to the third after losing 13 points in 2 weeks. The Newts are on the slide. Republicans are getting nervous, and they're pulling out all stops to prevent a Ron Paul victory. Chris Wallace kicked things off last week on Fox, saying if Ron Paul won, it would discredit the caucuses. Iowa Republicans are echoing those remarks, and the knives are coming out. The co-chair of Michelle Bachmann's Iowa campaign said this about a Ron Paul victory: to see the process hijacked would be a concern for those who consider the honor we have of being first in the nation. Well, the Republican establishment sees Ron Paul, I guess you could say, as some kid in the back of the classroom with a smaller desk making a lot of noise, and they just have to deal with him so they can move on. They don't like Ron Paul. They don't want him. And they're afraid that he'll run as a third-party candidate if he just gets enough support around the country. They're trying to shut him up, discredit him any way they can, and it sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Republicans don't like democracy unless their guy wins. They're trying to shut Democrats up with voter suppression laws in states across this country. But the thing about democracy is sometimes your candidate loses. And I didn't hear Republicans complaining about anybody hijacking the 2000 election back down in Florida. Remember those days? Ron Paul is the only candidate on the Republican side who has been consistently rising in the polls since day one. He hasn't had the big dip, the big gaffe. His values have been in line with the Tea Party since, well, since before there was a Tea Party. Establishment Republicans riled up the Tea Party last year to win back the House, and it worked. Now they have to deal with the beast they created, which may be a Ron Paul victory in Iowa. I mean, they are out to get this guy off the map and out of the way and move somebody in from the establishment. What's the big deal? You know, why are they trashing Ron Paul? Do they not want him part of the flock? What's going on here? What do you make of it?
Of course they don't want him as part of the flock. They see him as kind of an interloper from the far right. And, you know, I would say in past years he was kind of considered the Lyndon LaRouche of the right wing, with obviously a much more serious following. But what's changed this year, unlike past years where Ron Paul has run, and I've talked to several Republican consultants about this, is that he actually has an organized ground game in Iowa and other states, which he's never really done before. And I think, you know, with all of the topsy-turvy nature of this primary, people didn't really realize that this guy could really have a groundswell and actually have an organization on the ground to win.
One of his big qualities, from what I'm hearing from my sources in Iowa, is that he's so non-threatening. I mean, when you meet Ron Paul, he's good at retail politics. He's just one of the nicest guys in the room, and you can't hold a grudge against the guy. Although Iowa Governor Terry Branstad had this to say about the Iowa caucuses: people are going to look at who comes in second and who comes in third. I mean, is this strategy of pretending Ron Paul doesn't exist, is this going to work for the Republicans?
I don't know that it will. I mean, because I feel like, you know, Ron Paul might be unique in this situation. You know, historically, the only person that's ever won the Iowa caucus and then gone on to win the presidency is George W. Bush. But with Ron Paul, if he were to actually pull this off and win this caucus, it would really force the media to take him seriously. And it's going to really put a damper on the plans of folks like Rick Perry and Michelle Bachmann, especially, whose campaign will essentially be over. She's put everything she has into Iowa. And considering that he's running, you know, in the top three going into New Hampshire and South Carolina, you know, it creates a real wrench in the works.
Ron Paul still trails Newt and Mitt Romney nationally, but he's the only other really candidate that's in double digits. Washington Post ABC News poll: Newt at 30, Romney at 30, Ron Paul at 15. Does he have a chance beyond Iowa? What do you think?
I think it's tough. You know, I think, look, this is a different Republican Party than we've dealt with 5 years ago. All the establishment folks I talk to say Romney, Romney, Romney. But, you know, that's what you were talking about earlier. They're kind of them trying to put the fix in. And, you know, I've been saying for a long time that, you know, that this Republican Party may be surprised at what the grassroots do. So,
the people that are being attracted to Ron Paul are, I think, obviously greater in numbers than the last time that he's run for president. But there's this 20-something and 30-something movement that is out there in this country that they're socially liberal, they're fiscally responsible, and they think that they can take care of themselves down the road, and they don't need any help at all or any kind of program at all, or you know what I mean? I mean, he's tapping into something new, isn't he?
Well, no, he absolutely is, and a lot of his critics will say that, well, you know, his vote really depends on the youth vote. But if you look at what he did, you know, at the straw poll in Iowa in August, you know, he did very, very well there. I think coming in second to Bachmann, if I'm not mistaken, and he did that without any college students in school. So I think these college kids have proven, these young people have proven that they will turn out for Ron Paul. Well, he's got a very, very serious following, and I think that could really prove a factor in this.
Well, they defeated Hillary Clinton in Iowa. I mean, the young kids got out for Barack Obama. I think there's a real parallel between the two candidates as far as demographics are concerned.
And the establishment here in Washington and the Republican establishment in Iowa has a case of the jitters right now. I was just in Iowa last week. There are some people who think you have the possibility to win that state. If not, they expect you to be very strong in the top 2 or 3. I want you to listen to this editorial in the Des Moines Register just the other day. The torpedoes are now in the water for Paul, and one of them is labeled, "A Paul win hurts the Iowa caucuses." I've heard similar worries from GOP leaders in Iowa who fear that Paul's crazy train will haul the caucuses out to the political fringes and derail forever, stranding Iowa's coveted status. Why are they so worried about you?
That's sort of entertaining. That's so much for democracy. As long as democracy goes their way, it's okay. But if you get enough support from, you know, the people, you win an election, and it doesn't mean anything. So I think they see me as a challenge for the status quo. You know, there's a lot of people I challenge, you know, everybody from the military-industrial complex to the banking system, to the bailouts, to our foreign policy. It's a big deal because I want changes. But that's what the American people want. The American people are with me, and that's why I believe I'm going up in the polls.
We've had this conversation a few times during the campaign, and it is fair to say that you are less out there, if you will, this campaign than you were in the last campaign. And you get amused by this in watching in the debates. However, there's still a question of whether, even if you perform well in Iowa, even if you win Iowa, can you grow to the point of being the Republican nominee? I ask in the context of this. We had a new poll, national poll this week, and we asked Republican voters, who would you vote for under no circumstances? In other words, which Republican would you never support? You, sir, topped that list. 43% of Republicans said they could not support you under any circumstances. Does that number suggest that while you're growing in popularity, you can't grow enough to win the nomination?
No, it doesn't mean that, and those aren't permanent numbers, but you might say, well, what about the young people coming into voting now? How do I do? Exceptionally well. What about independents? Exceptionally well. What about the willingness of a Democrat to vote for me versus the other ones? All of a sudden, there is the coalition. What surprises me is really, parties are supposed to try to build, and the Republican Party would like to build so they don't have to fight for these elections all the time. So I have young people, I have independents, and a lot of Democrats will come my way. Why wouldn't they ask me a question and say, what is it they like about you? Because we'd like to, build our party, but they never do. What they want to do is say I don't count and lock me out and say, oh, if you are elected, it's just a fluke. We don't want your people in our party. We have a close-knit party, and if there's these new, young, energetic people, if they come in, oh, that's bad for the party. I don't really understand that, so I don't understand their rhetoric about building the party and then saying, well, we don't want Ron Paul's people coming in because they might take over the party. Well, what if we have an influence, and what if we believe in liberty and peace and prosperity and sound money? What's so dangerous about that?
Some of those young people, I was struck by it when I was in Iowa last week. It's a lot like it was for President Obama back in 2008. They support you, not necessarily the party. It's more personal than it is the party.
Ron Paul is kicking ass. In Iowa, he's up to #1. Latest polls have him at 23%, Romney at 20%, Gingrich all the way down to 14%. So what is happening? Well, the establishment is losing it. I want you to understand that this is not a segment we're doing because I love Ron Paul, or I'm a big supporter of Ron Paul. But you got to call things as they are. And when you look at how the establishment is treating him, especially among Republicans and on Fox News, it's an absolute injustice. Let's start with Bill O'Reilly. He was on the Today Show. This is what he says about Ron Paul.
Ron Paul. His foreign policy disqualifies him in my eyes as an American, not as a journalist. But, you know, I don't think we need another Neville Chamberlain with Iran. And, you know, so he wants to be friends with Iran as well.
Number 1 in Iowa, number 2 in New Hampshire. It doesn't matter. Fox News is going to disqualify him. Why? Because O'Reilly thinks his policy on Iran is terrible. Really? But while he was interviewing Mitt Romney, here's what Bill O'Reilly had to say about Iran and the idea of attacking it. Watch.
You're a tough guy. You're going to stare them down and say, look, I'm going to use them? Because if you bomb Iran, that starts World War III. You know that. I mean, they're going to try to block Hormuz. Oil will double. The unintended consequences all against the United States all over the Muslim world will be horrible. That's what Iran is banking.
So you know what? It turns out Bill O'Reilly actually doesn't want to attack Iran. He doesn't disqualify Ron Paul based on that. He agrees with Ron Paul actually on that issue. The thing is, Fox News and the rest of the conservative establishment and the Republicans, they're desperate to disqualify Ron Paul for any reason. By the way, what's the real reason? It's because he might end the corruption in Washington. And those guys feed off and live on that corruption. Now, when you go inside the state of Iowa, Politico had an interesting article. In fact, the headline is Paul Panic Seizes Iowa Establishment. And that is very accurate. Look at this quote from Becky Beach. She's an Iowa Republican who worked for both Bushes. It would make the caucuses mostly irrelevant, if not entirely irrelevant, if Ron Paul wins. It would have a very damaging effect because I don't think he could be elected president. So, and both Iowa and national Republicans wouldn't think he represents the will of the voters. Two unbelievable things there. First, when Ron Paul was in second or third place, they said, oh, it's irrelevant. He's in second or third. Now that he's winning, they're like, well, if he wins, then the whole caucus becomes irrelevant. But not only that, she says that he would not reflect the will of the Iowa voters. But if he won, he just won the vote. They would have just voted in Iowa. They would have selected Ron Paul, but ahead of time, the Republican establishment is saying, well, if the voters vote that way, they must not have meant it. It's mental. It makes no sense. But they keep on continuing. The Iowa House Speaker, Craig Polson, says, I don't think any candidate perverting the process in that fashion helps the caucuses in any way. You know what he's referring to? The fact that he's got a lot of people on the ground who support him and hence will go vote for him. But that's the whole point of the caucus. When Obama did that in Iowa, everybody went nuts like, oh my God, look at all this enthusiasm on the ground that he has. It wasn't perverting the process back then. And look, I supported Obama. So again, I'm not on Paul's side here in terms of politics. But when you look at it, it's outrageous to say that if he does what every other candidate has done in Iowa, it would pervert the process. They can't stand this guy. Now we go to one other guy, a pretty important guy in Iowa, the governor, Terry Branstad, of course, another Republican. He says, people are going to look at who comes in second and who comes in third. If Romney comes in a strong second, it definitely helps him going into New Hampshire and the other states. So wait a minute, let me get this right. When Ron Paul was in second or third, it was irrelevant being in second or third. When Ron Paul is winning, well, then who wins is irrelevant, and you got to look at who came in second or third? Third? What are we talking about, third? This is the dumbest thing I have ever seen in my life because they're scared to death of Ron Paul. All right, now here comes Sam Clovis, who's apparently an influential talk radio host in Northwest Iowa. He says, I think a Paul win would be devastating for the state of Iowa and the caucus process. Now, here's my favorite part. You see the political writing there at the end? He endorsed Rick Santorum on Monday. But wait a minute, Rick Santorum has less of a chance of winning the nomination overall than Ron Paul does. He does much worse in Iowa, New Hampshire, and in every other poll nationwide. So if Santorum wins, why wouldn't it disqualify Iowa then? No, Santorum's okay, but not Ron Paul. He'll stop the corruption. And then finally, Tamara Scott, who's Bachman's state co-chair, who earlier was talking about how great and important Iowa caucuses were while Bachman was leading. She says now, to see the process hijacked would be a concern for those who consider the honor we have of being the first in the nation. In other words, if Ron Paul wins, somehow he has hijacked the process. This is crazy talk, man. the establishment, especially Republican establishment, can't stand Ron Paul because he would end business as usual.